picking up our map that we used last week and went through, and I'm not going to go through each one of these step by step the way we did last week. In fact, it's not necessary to know these particular things and to get the introduction to the book of Thessalonians. So merely for those of you who were last week, you know that when Paul went on his second journey, he went up, he picked up Timothy, goes on over to Troas, picked up Luke, went on up to Philippi and left Luke off, and then he went on over to Thessalonica. He and Paul and Silas went over there. So I'm going to erase this off of the map, and we'll start out tonight and get into the book itself about the way that it actually is. Now over there where we have the red dot, or the red X with the yellow dot, that's the city of Thessalonians. What's the city right below it? Berea, that's right. So now then we're over here at Thessalonica there, and that green, everybody can tell my wonderful drawing, can't you? I did that myself. Anybody that looked at that would know that is a mountain range. And if you didn't know that, you have a problem. So that's a mountain range. What's the name of that mountain range? It's the Olympics, the Olympic Mountains. And the important thing to know about that is what? It's the headquarters of all of the big Greek gods. All of those mysterious gods that they had, they made their headquarters up there on Mount Olympus. And so down at the bottom at Thessalonica would be then the headquarters really of heathenism, paganism, idolatry. It would be the same as Rome is with Catholicism. So this is going to be a very meaningful thing as you read the book of Thessalonians then, to understand that particular aspect of it. Okay, now then, we're going to get into it, and you're going to need to know from here on the things now that we are going to be talking about here. What chapter in the book of Acts would we go to which gives Paul's history of where he was to find where he went over and established the church at Thessalonica? Try one more. 17. We started at 16 last week, and so that's fine if you got it in your notes, but we started at Philippi. And then from Philippi, he goes on over to Thessalonica. Now, we're not going to go through that again, of where he went over to Thessalonica, but we are going to make it in this way. Paul left Thessalonians. Now, I want you to watch this, then I'm going to show you how we know it here. Now, he left Thessalonians up there, Thessalonica, and he left Timothy up there. He and Silas went down to what town? Berea. He goes down to Berea. He spends some time there. And the Jews up at Thessalonica were so mad at him, they came down, stirred up a lot of trouble, and so he had to leave Thessalonica. Now, when he left Thessalonica then, they took him down, and he got on a boat, and he left Titus there. He gets on that boat. The brethren bring him around to what town? Athens. All right, they bring him around to Athens. So Paul now is down to Athens all by himself. Now let's stop right there, and let's go back now to our Bible and see how we know these things here. So as we start now in chapter 17, I'm just going to pick out the verses that I want us to see here. We pick it out here in verse 17. Now when they had passed through Amphipolis, Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul, as his custom was, went in, and so he started teaching in there then. Down in verse 4, and some of them persuaded and consorted with Paul and Silas. Silas is down there with him, and as we've learned, Timothy is also going to be. So they're down there now at Thessalonica. Then we get down to verse 10. They cause so much trouble at Thessalonica that Paul has to leave Thessalonica and go down to Berea. That's in verse 10. And the brethren immediately sent away Paul and Silas by night unto Berea. Now, who did they send away? Paul and Silas. So who would be left up there? Timothy would be left up there. Now then, let's go on down now to, where do we want to get to here? In verse 13. But when the Jews of Thessalonica had knowledge that the word of God was proclaimed of Paul at Berea also, they came thither likewise, stirring up and troubling the multitude. And then immediately the brethren sent forth Paul to go as far as the sea, and Silas and Timothy abode there still. Now then, Silas and Timothy are going to be left up there, and Paul is going to go over to the sea. We'll see in a minute. He's going on down to Athens down there. Now, when he leaves Silas and Timothy up there, they're left up in this particular area that's up here. Renee, we closed last week. You asked a question about that. He left them up there. And so was Timothy down at Berea. He may have come down to Berea, but it's going to be going back and forth right here in this little neighborhood of Berea and so forth. But here's the thing to keep in mind. Timothy is the man for Thessalonica. Silas is the man for Berea. Now, when Paul's tours, his journeys, he had a system. It was a very great method he had, and he would establish churches, and then he would leave some preacher there at that church to develop that church. And then he would go, and then he would leave another man to develop that church. Now, for instance, where has he left Luke? At Philippi. So he's left Luke at Philippi, and he won't pick him up again until we get over into the 20th chapter. So he leaves Luke at Philippi to work with the church at Philippi. He goes down to Thessalonica, leaves Timothy at Thessalonica, goes down to Berea, leaves Silas at Berea, and he himself gets out of town. Now, this is an escape mechanism. I mean, he's in trouble. He has to get out of town. And so he got out. They brought him down to, what town is this down here? I didn't put names on them. Down to Athens. Okay. Now then, let's look down here at verse 14. Then immediately the brethren sent forth Paul to go as far as the sea. Silas and Timothy abode there still. But they that conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and receiving a commandment unto Silas and Timothy that they should come to him with all speed, they departed. So now, this is interesting, and it's important. So now, he goes down to Athens. He's there all by himself. Now, here these people take him down in their boat. They get ready to go home, and what is the commandment that Paul tells them then? Tell Timothy and Silas to get down here. How fast? Fast as they can, with all speed. So now the brethren are going to take the boat. They're going to back up there, tell Timothy and Silas to get back down. All right, now in verse 16. Now, while Paul waited for them at Athens. So now Paul is by himself at Athens, and then the rest of the things that you read is what takes place in Athens. That's not part of our story tonight. Athens was a city that you would call an intellectual city. It was a philosopher's city. Everybody, all the philosophers gathered in Athens just to tell new things that they had heard. So Paul stayed there. That's where they had so many idols that they made that idol to what kind of a god? To an unknown god, just in case they forgot one. And so Paul looked at all of these things, and his spirit was provoked, and so he preached a sermon then on idolatry. But he converted only a few. Now then, in chapter 18, now because we're going to pass over Athens, after these things he departed from Athens and came to Corinth. Now, if he left Athens and went to Corinth, how are Timothy and Silas going to know that he's over at Corinth? Interesting thing. But here's what happened. What is it that he told Paul and Silas to do? Come down with all speed. Now, they did. See, the boat went back, come down with all speed, and they did. They went back, and they met him at Athens. Now, you don't read that in the book of Acts. So you say, how do you know it? All right, the way you know it is this. Later on, Paul is going to write a letter back up to the Thessalonians, and he's going to tell them. See, he will tell them. So when we get over that letter, he's going to tell them. Now you say, well, how can you know? Okay, let's flip over to 1 Thessalonians. We'll put two and two together in this thing, and we can see how we can find it out. Now, stop to think. The book of Acts is a history book written by Luke. Luke is not interested in telling all of the details. See, all the details of every little thing that happened. So he's just telling the major things. Paul went to Athens, then Paul went to Corinth. Now, Paul's going to tell us something, though, over here. So turn just immediately. We'll put all this in context later. But turn down immediately now to chapter 3, verse 1. Now, Paul said in this text, he said, wherefore when we... Now, I want to stop there, and I want to talk about that we for just a minute, because that might throw your mind. When you see we, you think of two or more, don't you? Now, there is such a thing as using we as what's called an editorial we. And that is when a writer is talking, he doesn't use I did this, and I did that, and I did this. And speakers do the same thing. How does it make you feel when somebody has itis, and I did this, and I went over here, and I... like this. So there is such a thing as using we when the audience knows you're talking about yourself. It's called an editorial we, and people use it all the time. It's kind of funny that back many, many years ago, there was an editor of a paper, one of the Brotherhood papers, Firm Foundation. His name was Lowell, and he used editorial we's all the time. He would never use I, never, ever use I. And in one article, he was writing in there, and he talked about, so we went over there, and he's meaning himself, and we picked up our wife, and I picked up my wife, and we went to a hotel, and and it started in there, and you read it, and you, hey, there shouldn't be an editorial we, you see, that's in here. So he got a lot of flack about that, people writing back and forth, but that's editorial we we're getting at. Yeah, no. Matt. That's what I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you that I know it is. Okay? Yeah. Okay, good question. Now, I know it is. Now, here is where he says up here, let's start out, let's go back up to chapter 2. If you don't know where that is, that's right before 3. And come down to verse 18. Paul said, because we would fain have come unto you, I, Paul, once and again. So how did he use that? See? So he's writing, he's saying this and this, and we would have come unto you, I, Paul. In other words, that's who it is. So he identifies himself. He shows, when I use this we, I'm talking about me. But Satan hindered us. Who did it hinder? It hindered I, Paul. See? Verse 3. Wherefore, when we could no longer forbear, we thought it good to be left behind at Athens alone, and sent Timothy, our brother and God's minister. So now then, he says, we were left alone, and we've sent Timothy up to you. So now, here is where, and by the way, who was supposed to come down? Timothy and Silas. Here he mentions only Timothy, but I'm going to flip back over and I'm going to show you Silas is still involved in this. See? Why doesn't Paul say, we sent Timothy and Silas, I sent Timothy and Silas back up to you? He didn't send Silas up to Thessalonica. He's writing this letter to the Thessalonians. Now, he's going to send Timothy and Silas back, but Timothy will go back to Thessalonica, and where will Silas go? To Berea. See, these churches need these men. So later, when Paul then writes, and he said, now, you remember when I was down to Athens, I sent Timothy to you, and Silas down to Berea. Is there any use of saying that? No. See, so you don't do that. So, but that is what he did. As you put it all together here, you can see the whole picture formulating. Now, here's the point that I want to get at right now. Here, verse 3, chapter 3, verse 1, Paul said, wherefore when I, could no longer forbear, I, thought it good to be left behind at Athens alone, and sent Timothy, our brother, God's minister, so forth to you. Now, when you go back to the book of Acts, and you study the life of Paul, there is only one time in all of his travels where he and Timothy could have ever been at Athens at the same time. Only one time. And where would that be? Back over here in Acts chapter 17, where Paul is in Athens, and he said, tell Timothy and Silas to come down to me. And we know that they came down because later on he said, I was left alone at Athens and sent them back up to you. See, it's the only place where it'll fit. Now, is there any question about that? I know I'm jumping around. I know if you're not familiar with the Acts story and so forth, and we're not familiar with Thessalonians yet, but do you see what I'm talking about? If Rod, if you found a letter here some of these days, let's say 100 years from now or 50 years from now, maybe our kids got it or something, and so they find a letter from Rod, and it says, Rod Hilden to Linda Heddy. And it says, we've just left Jerusalem to go to a certain place. Do you know what year that is? That letter is written in. Doesn't have a date on it. You could go back to Rod's life and run it down and find out when did he go to Israel. And she, that's when he went, 1999, I guess, wasn't it? So this letter was written in 1999. Well, how'd you know that? See, because of a statement that he makes. And Rod says in there, he said, now, there was one time that we was over there that Denise and I thought that it was good to be left alone with Helen and go buy a teapot. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean I wasn't there? No, I was there. But what happened is she wanted to go back and buy a teapot. And it's crazy. I mean, it's stupid to go back and do that. So she goes and tells Denise, they're talking, and Denise is, I start to say stupid. So Denise is stupid enough to go. She said, I'll go with you. And oh, good. They went and got Rod. Rod said, I'll go. So they went. And here I go, trotting along behind them to get there. Now, here's the whole point that I'm getting at. If Rod wrote a letter, they'd get it 100 years from now, and it says, so Denise and Helen and I decided to go back and buy a teapot. Does that mean that there wasn't anybody else with them? No. It just means that he doesn't consider me important in there. Another person writes a letter, and they find it, you see, at the same time, and maybe they find Kim's letter, and it says in the letter, dear so-and-so, I'll never forget Dad telling the story about the time that he went back with Rod, Denise, and Helen to get the teapot. Is there a contradiction in there? No, there's no contradiction. That's the way that you do New Testament books. You put them together, and you say, okay, how do they fit? So now here's the way that it goes. Timothy was left up at Thessalonica. Silas was left at Berea. Paul went down to Athens. He got down to Athens. He said, send Timothy and Silas back down to me. Now, when Timothy and Silas got back down to him, he was so upset, he sent them right back. He said, now I want you to go right back. Now, you go back, and he said, I'm going over to Corinth, and I'll go over to Corinth, and then you come back over here. So he sent him back up there, and I'll go to Corinth and meet you over there, and so you come back down to Corinth. Now, why was he so upset? Why was he so upset? That's where we learn right here in the book of 1 Thessalonians why he was so upset. Now, we're going to read it here in just a minute. But remember, what kind of a church would it have been at Thessalonica? This is important to read the whole book. What kind of converts were they? Were they mainly Jewish or Gentile? They were Gentile. That they were idolaters. They'd been converted out of idolatry. Now, when they were converted out of idolatry, those idolaters that were there began to persecute those Christians who were converted out of idolatry. You remember what the Jews did back in Jerusalem when Jews were converted to Christ? What did the other Jews do to them? Persecuted them. Now, this is the same thing that these idolaters are going to do, and Paul will make a parallel. That these idolaters are getting ready to persecute any other idolater that has been converted to Christ, even to the point of killing them. So some of these brethren were giving their lives. Now, what would you think if you went into some country where you've never been and you converted some idolaters? In our day, with all of the trouble we've got, you go somewhere and you convert some Muslims. And they take after you, and they're going to kill you, and you have to leave town. And then you hear that they're actually killing some of those Muslims that you converted. They're killing them. And all of these people are new converts up here in this place. What do you normally expect to happen to that church? Are those new converts going to be strong enough to go through that persecution and even die? New converts, babes in Christ, not old people that are, truly convicted. So they're new. So Paul is worried sick. He can't stand it. So that's why he said, tell them to come down. They got down, and they said, Paul, everything is going fine, but boy, they are under persecution. They are even killing them up there. He said, get back up. Why would he send them right back up? They need help. Get back up there. You help them, and then you get back down to Corinth as soon as you can. Now, let's see how Paul felt. That's the way he felt. He was just as nervous and anxious as he could be when he writes then the Thessalonians. By the way, Timothy did go back up. Timothy came back down and met Paul at Corinth down there. And when he met him, let's just look at it right here. When he met him back down there at Corinth, he gave him a report. Do you know what the report said? They are wonderful. They are withstanding the persecution. They are dying for the Lord. They are preaching the gospel. They're spreading the word out. This church is an outstanding church. How would Paul have felt when he got that word? Whew. Oh, man, give me a pen and paper. Now, what would you expect this letter to be about under those conditions? This is going to be a love letter. This is going to be a letter of appreciation. This is going to be a bragging letter. This is going to be a letter where he said, I am so happy with you people. Here's what you've done. It is so great, and blah, blah. And he's going to be bragging on them. And then he's going to tell them why he was so concerned that he sent Timothy back up. So let's go back over now to 1 Thessalonians, and we'll flip back over there in the 3rd chapter again. And we'll see here where Paul makes a statement. Now, I want you to note up here in chapter 2, verse 14. For ye, brethren, became imitators of the churches of God which are in Judea in Christ Jesus. For you also suffered the same things of your own countrymen, even as they did of the Jews, who both killed the Lord Jesus and the prophets, and drove us out, and please not God, and are contrary to all men. Just like the Jews down at Jerusalem did to the other Jews, your brethren have done to you. Now, he knows that. So in chapter 3, verse 1, he said, wherefore, when we could no longer forbear, that means when I was a nervous wreck, when I couldn't stand it any longer, we thought it good to be left behind at Athens alone. That's something he never did. But I thought it was a good thing I'd just be here alone by myself and get Timothy back up there to you, our brother in God's minister in the gospel, to establish you I wanted him to get back up there to establish you and to comfort you. Do you see why they would need establishing and comforting? See? Establish your faith, that no man be moved by these afflictions. For yourself know that hereunto we are appointed. For verily when we were with you, we told you beforehand that we are to suffer affliction, even as it came to pass, and you know. So I warned you that you would be afflicted. For this cause, I, when I could no longer forbear, sent that I might know your faith, lest by any means the tempter had tempted you, and our labor would be in vain. Matt, do you see here now where he comes back and explains again who the I is? You see here, it can't possibly be anybody else except Paul. So here, when I could no longer forbear, I sent him up there. I just had to know your faith. So I set him up. Now then, look in verse 6. Here's a key. Now when Timothy came even now unto us from you, and brought us good tidings of your faith, he gave us good news. Now, stop. Right there, in Acts, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 6, Paul tells you where he was, what he was doing when he wrote the 1 Thessalonian letter. It was a time of where Timothy had just come down to him. Now, skip back to the book of Acts. Paul was in Athens. Timothy and Silas came down. He sent them back. Find out. I'll go to Corinth. Then you come down and meet me. Okay. In the first 4 verses, it tells about Paul went over to Corinth. He met Priscilla and Aquila. He worked with them. And in verse 5, and when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul was constrained by the word, testifying to the Jews, and so forth. Now, there, in chapter 18, verse 5, here, is where Paul, is where you can write down on your margin 1 Thessalonians. That's where Paul wrote the 1 Thessalonian book. Right there at that verse. As soon as Timothy and Silas came back down, brought him good news, he sat down and he wrote the book. And you get that by comparing Acts 18:5 with 1 Thessalonians there that we've got up there. Now this is a little confusing. But do you see what I'm doing? Do you see how I'm putting it together? Taking his life and putting the statements together. And there's no question. I mean, we're talking about something that there's no question about. See? Where did he write that book? Right there. In Acts 7, Acts 18, and in verse 5. Sat down and he wrote it. Now, when he sat down and he wrote it, there's the background. The background is, you can move out of Acts now, back over to 1 Thessalonians. The background is that he sat down, he wrote this book, and it's a book that was written by a man who has spent all this time in great anxiety of what's happening to that Thessalonian church. They're being killed by their idolatrous brethren, their friends that's back there. Will they stand? Has our labor been all in vain? And Timothy brings the good news. They're doing great. Can't you just feel how you would write a letter? Just, whew. And so you sit down and you write the letter. Now let me ask you, before you ever read this letter, when we get through the next 3 minutes, you can go home and read the letter and pretty well understand the letter, and you can see what's in it. Do you expect any deep doctrinal points in this letter? No, they're not going to be those doctrinal points that are in there. See, this is going to be a letter of expression of personal anxiety, of personal comfort, of wow, whew, am I relieved? And And now, what is it that he will want to do to those brethren? What do they stand in need of? Do they stand in need to know that it's okay to eat meat? Do they stand in need to know that the old law's taken out of the way? No, that's not a problem. What is it? What is it that these brethren up at Thessalonica need right now? Encouragement. That's what they need, encouragement. That's what this letter is going to be about. To encourage them. When you encourage somebody, do you rebuke them and bawl them out? No, you brag on them. See, you brag on them and you do this. So that's what this letter in here really is going to be about. This First Thessalonian letter is going to be a bragging letter in there. So if we put it up here, then you can break down the First Thessalonian letter in this way. Chapters 1 through 3 are Paul's personal feelings, his personal comments, his telling them how he feels and so forth that's in there. Now, that's the first 3 chapters. Now, in chapter 4, we're going to find 2 reasons to write this letter. Now, the first reason is exhortation, build them up. Then there's a couple other reasons. When Paul came down, Timothy came down, he said, Paul, they're doing great. Now, there are 2 slight problems that need to be addressed. Number 1, these people have come out of idolatry. And when you go in and you convert a lot of idolaters, do you expect new converts to be able to give up all of their old ways immediately, especially if they don't know what they're supposed to give up? You see, they're converted to Christ, and so they don't know this, they don't know that, and so they are striving, but the one thing that they kind of brought in with them as they came over is something that's kind of hard for you and me to understand. But if you were converted to Mormonism, what is it you would probably take with you in Mormonism and do for the first month or 2 before they got you straightened out? You know? Drink coffee, okay? You probably take your coffee with you, Coke, something of that nature. And they'd be telling, no, you can't drink this. How would you feel if somebody told you, and here all your life you've been drinking coffee? When you drink a cup of coffee, how many times you sat down, drink a cup of coffee, and think, boy, this is horrible. God's looking down on me now. This is about the worst thing that I can possibly do. See? How many times? You don't. See? And then somebody comes and said, do you know that drinking that cup of coffee is the worst thing you could possibly do? Well, that's what these people have, only their problem is different, and it's hard for us to understand. Their problem was fornication. They were used to fornication, daily basis. No problem. It was part of their religion. It was a religious practice that those idolaters did. So, fornication, what was it? No different than when a woman walks in here for me to say, hi, Linda, how you doing? Somebody come up and say, Lord, do you know, my, do you understand how bad that is for you to speak to a woman? How long would it take to get that through my mind that I'm not supposed to speak to a woman? Well, these idolaters here that committing this fornication and told they can't do that anymore. Why? It's just a normal thing. So they were still involved in fornication. Now I spend this time trying to show you it wasn't like some of us going out and committing fornication tonight. If any one of us did that, we'd have a guilty conscience, we'd know it's wrong, and so forth. These people, it was a totally different circumstance. So they brought it in. So he came down and he said, Paul, they still have a problem with this fornication. So Paul is going to deal with fornication and tell him, look, stop that. Then there was another problem. The only other problem they had was, he said, Paul, they're up there and they're being killed. Some of them are being killed because they're Christians for their faith. Some people are being killed, and when a person is killed, their loved ones are just absolutely sick. They're absolutely sick because those dead Christians don't have any hope. They died before Christ came back. And so they lost their life. They lost everything. And so it's something to really cry about. And so Paul is going to write and tell them, look, you don't cry because somebody has lost their life. Let me tell you, it doesn't make any difference whether you're alive or dead when Christ comes back, because you're going to be on an equal footing. The first thing that will happen is the dead will rise out of the grave. The second thing that will happen is that those who are alive will be changed. Then everybody together will be caught up to meet the Lord in the air. So there's no advantage of living. There's no advantage of dying. So don't sorrow because of that. Those are the two problems he'll deal with. And then the last part is he'll exhort them. He'll tell them, do this, do that. He'll give them some exhortations. That's what 1 Thessalonian letter is going to be about. And I would advise you to go home and just sit down and read it. And you sit down, you read it, you say, I understand it. I can see now what that is all about. It's there. I've had more than one preacher to tell me that they preached for many years, and until they went through actually this introduction, like we're going through, put it in place, that they didn't understand that. And they went home and they read it, just like I'm saying, and he said, it's right. Understand things never understood before. And so it can happen to all of us in that way, and that's the reason an introduction is really so important there. Now then, he sent him back up then there, and this book is written in 52 AD, as we talked about last week. 19 years after the church was established is what it was. Okay, real quickly, let's go back now, and we pick it up here again. And so we have the fact here that Timothy takes the first letter back, and he checks on them. Then he comes back down to Paul, and he tells them there about the problem, the report, about good and bad problems. Paul writes the second letter then. After he gets back, he writes the second letter. And the second letter is to help them out of something they're confused about. Now, they're confused about the second coming. What happened was that in the first letter that we talked about, they were sick and crying because if somebody got killed before Christ came back, that person was lost. That person, they had no hope. And so Paul straightens that out. No, it doesn't make any difference whether you're dead or alive. So don't get that out of there, you see. So Christ's coming back. Now, Paul goes up, and they get that straightened out. But then they got it in their mind some way Christ was coming back just any day. He's coming back just any time now, and it caused them to do some things they shouldn't be doing. The one thing is that a lot of them quit their jobs. What would you do if you were just certain the Lord's coming back in 30 days? You go look at your bank account and you see you got enough money to last 30 days. I'll just quit my job and spend this 30 days then doing this. Well, what would happen when the 30 days is up and your money's run out? You know he's coming back just any day within the next month. You know for sure. Well, I'd go to Oliver and say, Oliver, could you loan me enough money to, you see, just for the next month? I know I won't have to pay it back because the Lord's coming. And so he loans it to me. Well, the Lord didn't come. Man, I'm starting to get in trouble now. So Rod, how about that? Oliver, I'll pay you back later. You see, Rod, could you loan me in here? And so now we've got some bums running around. And so he's going to deal with that. Any of you doing that, get back to work. See? You misunderstood the whole thing. The Lord is not coming back very soon. It's going to be on down there. So that's what he's going to tell them in the second letter that's there. So the letters are going to be pretty simple then, as you read it. This again was written in 52 A.D. This is just a guess. How long would it take Paul to go back, or Timothy to go back up, find out about him, come back down, bring him the letter? You see, so we're looking at probably 2, 3, 4 months difference that's in here. So these letters are put together there in 52 A.D. First two letters that was written. Okay. As we look at this, you begin to look at a letter in the New Testament. All letters in the first century. Now this is all letters, not Bible letters, but all letters. If a person sat down to write a letter to Dad and Mom, if a person sat down to write a letter to Caesar, if you were going to write a letter to the school system, you're going to write a letter to your attorney, whatever it is, there was a certain thing that you did. They were formulated on the same pattern, the same way that we do today. Today, you'd sit down, Dear Mom, bip, 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 then down at the end, love you, Lowell. Put something like this. In those days, they began with the person writing the letter. In other words, if I was going to write my mom, I'd say, I, Lowell. That's the first thing that they always did. The second thing, they named to whom they were writing. I, Lowell, to my wonderful mother. I, Lowell, to the honorable judge somewhere. You state to whom you're writing. Then you give a greeting of some way, what we would say a hello in some way in there. They would say grace and peace, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. And then you'd write the body. So I'd say, I, Lowell, to the Honorable Judge Smith. Grace and peace. Mr. Smith, I have this problem. And then I would write the letter. The next thing I would do when I got through, I would sign off, or yearly by salute so-and-so. If you're writing a letter to Mom, I get through, I'd say, sign off and say, salute my brothers and sisters. In other words, tell my brothers and sisters that I said hi, is the way we would put it today. Now, you notice I left a big space up in there. That's what it was insisted of. Now then, Paul added one other thing in his letters. As Paul wrote letters, he always inserted a prayer and compliments about the church at that time. He'd give them a greeting, I, Paul, to the church of Thessalonians, grace and peace. My prayer to God for you is, he would offer a prayer. I pray to God and I thank Him because you are such nice people. You do this and you do that. And he'd give them some kind of a compliment. Now, there's only one book that he didn't do that in. That's the book of Galatians. And he left that out. What would that show you even before we get to the book of Galatians, where he leaves that out? I'm not happy. I don't know anything to thank God about you people, you see. So he started out, and he just said, I marvel that you're so quickly removed from him. And he starts right out in that way. So there's what you're going to find then in this particular letter that we've got here. Okay, now we turn to 1 Thessalonians 1 and verse 1. We got our salutation. Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy. Now, Silvanus is the long form. What would the short form be? Silas. They'd call him Silas then, and there. But, so these three. Now, of course, he puts them in, as he did most of his letters. Not that they were writing the letter, but they were with him. They were with him when he was writing the letter there. And then he comes to addresses the two, the church of God in here, the church at Thessalonica puts it this way, unto the church of the Thessalonians, in God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. So I'm writing to the church in God and in Jesus Christ, the one that's in God and in Jesus Christ. When you use the word church back there, that was a word that was used all the time. What did that word mean? The called out, a called out body of people. Suppose that I told you today that I wrote a letter to a group of people. Who did I write to? You don't know, do you? I might have written to the city council about my sidewalks. I might have written to a church somewhere. I might have written to, it's a group of people. That's what church means. It means a called out group, a spatial group. A city council could be called a church. You remember the group of people over in Ephesus that came down into the amphitheater and was crying out, great is Diana the goddess? They were called a church. They were called out of the city. But now, I'm writing to the church in Thessalonica that's in God and Christ. The one that has the relationship with God and Christ. The one that is part of them, you see. So, he's identifying them in that way. All right, next he says, grace and peace. Now, grace was the Greek salutation meaning favor. The word grace literally means an unmerited favor. It's a favor that you don't deserve. If I've been doing you a lot of favors and doing some work for you and come over and help you dig a ditch and so forth, and as I said tonight, my car won't start, and you say, here, Lowell, take my car and drive it tomorrow. Well, you've done me a favor. But is it an unmerited favor? Well, you don't owe it to me, but you kind of feel like you do, don't you? In other words, I've been working for you the last month, and you see, you think, well, yeah, I'll give this to Lowell. But let's suppose I tell you my sad story, and somebody comes up tonight and says, here, Lowell, here's keys to my car. Now, that's an unmerited favor. I haven't done anything for you. It's a fair favor I haven't worked for. Now, that's what the Greeks would do. They'd say, grace, 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 grace. We say good day. See, good day, good day. What does good day mean? What does it mean, and then what does it mean? Well, when you say good day, that means I hope you have a good day, doesn't it? That's really what it means. But when you're going along, you say good day, and they say good day. What does that mean? You don't really think that. Now, this is what these people would say as they would go through grace, 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 you see, all the time. But it was based on that. Now, Paul would put some meaning in it when he would say it that's in there. Peace. Then is the Jewish. This is the word for shalom. We've all heard that word when two Jews meet, shalom, shalom. And I had a Jew to tell me, I said, what exactly does the word mean? He said, well, it means all is well with you. It's not peace with like in war, but it's I hope all is okay, and I hope every part of you is okay. It's everything working together. Your family, your job, your health, in other words, that's what they used when they would say peace, is that everything is there. Now, when Paul would do this, then he would generally say, grace to you and peace. Then he'd say, from our Lord Jesus Christ. And here, he really didn't have to. There was no problem with these people at this time in doing that. So, we have now the salutation that he gives to them. Now then, we come to the body of the letter. And as we start with the body of the letter, what's the first thing that Paul would do before he got into his body? He'd always start out in that body by inserting what? A prayer. So that's what he's going to do. Now, this is where our time is up tonight, but next week we'll start out, we give thanks to God always. So he's going to thank God for these people, and we'll start breaking it down and looking at the book then, studying the book itself then for this next week. Okay.